You are not approaching the contact phase, you are not preparing for it, you are already inside it. What shifted was not the world around you, it was the stability of the signal you are emitting into the field. This is not a metaphor and it is not symbolic language. Reality responds to coherence, not effort, and your signal has reached a level of consistency that no longer collapses under observation. That is why this phase has opened without announcement, without spectacle, and without demand. Your signal is not what you say, think, or visualize. It is the emotional baseline you return to when nothing is happening. It is the frequency your body broadcasts when you are not trying to manage outcomes. Stabilization occurs when this baseline stops swinging between urgency and avoidance. When the nervous system no longer treats the future as a threat or a prize, the field detects coherence. This is the only requirement. Nothing else qualifies you. Nothing else disqualifies you. The chaos that preceded this was not a mistake. It was necessary. Instability must surface before it can discharge. Old emotional loops intensify when they are losing structural support. Confusion, exhaustion, emotional flattening, or a sense of disorientation are not signs of failure. They are symptoms of recalibration. The system cannot stabilize without first revealing what has been destabilizing it. What you felt falling apart was not your direction, it was your interference. Stabilization does not feel like excitement. It feels like quiet certainty. It feels like the absence of urgency. It feels like you stopped asking certain questions without deciding to stop. This is because once coherence locks, the mind no longer needs to chase reassurance. Desire does not disappear, but it stops shouting. When the signal underneath desire is steady, the field no longer requires emotional amplification to respond. Contact does not mean something is arriving from somewhere else. That model belongs to a fragmented identity. Contact is permeability. It is the thinning of the boundary between what you call inner and outer. When your signal stabilizes, separation loses density. Information does not travel toward you, it reveals itself through you. This is why seeking signs often delays them. Seeking introduces tension, and tension thickens the membrane. Calm dissolves it. You may notice that you are less reactive than before. Less impressed by promises. Less disturbed by delays. Less compelled to interpret every sensation. This is not numbness. This is coherence. The field cannot engage unstable signals without distortion. Now that your baseline has settled, responsiveness becomes possible without overwhelm. This is why nothing dramatic is happening yet. Drama would destabilize what just stabilized. There is nothing to activate. There is nothing to summon. Doing would interfere. Recognition is sufficient. The moment you see that stabilization has already occurred, the field registers confirmation. This is how alignment works. Not by force, but by clarity. Not by control, but by allowance. This is the contact phase, and it began the moment you stopped trying to enter it. If you are aligned with this frequency, subscribe and remain within it. Contact only activates after you stop reaching because reaching bends the signal out of alignment. Reaching is not desire, it is tension. It is the identity leaning forward, attempting to pull reality toward itself instead of allowing reality to respond. The field does not respond to intensity. It responds to coherence. When you reach, you compress the signal. When you allow, it stabilizes. Reaching always carries an unspoken message. It says, "This is not here yet." That message becomes instruction. The field mirrors identity, not words. When identity is positioned as not yet, the field maintains distance to remain accurate. This is why effort feels exhausting and results feel delayed when you are trying to make contact happen. You are emitting the frequency of separation while asking for union. The field cannot contradict you. Effort-based seeking fragments the signal because it introduces oscillation. One moment you are hopeful, the next you are doubtful. One moment you are certain, the next you are checking for proof. This fluctuation is instability. The field waits for steadiness. It does not punish fluctuation, it simply cannot respond clearly to it. Contact requires a signal that does not chase its own reflection. Non-attachment is not indifference. It is recognition without grasping. It is knowing without leaning. When non-attachment settles, the signal stops projecting into the future. It rests in the present moment. Creation only happens here. Contact only opens here. The moment identity stops stretching forward, it becomes available where it already is. This is the reversal most people miss. They think stopping means losing momentum. In reality, stopping removes resistance. Recognition is the coherent state. Recognition says, this is already in motion. Recognition says, nothing needs to be pulled closer. Recognition collapses the gap because it no longer believes in the gap. This is why contact phases often begin when someone gives up trying. Not because they failed, but because they stopped emitting interference. The signal finally becomes readable. Identity leaning forward always assumes that something external will complete it. That assumption is distortion. The field cannot confirm incompleteness by delivering wholeness. It waits until the identity no longer needs completion to allow connection. This is not a test. It is a compatibility requirement. Contact cannot stabilize inside an identity that is still reaching outward for validation. When you stop reaching, something subtle happens. Your emotional baseline levels out. You are no longer scanning the environment for confirmation. You are no longer rehearsing outcomes. The nervous system relaxes. This relaxation is not passive. It is precise. It sharpens the signal. The quieter the broadcast, the clearer the transmission. Contact activates when identity stands upright in the present moment instead of leaning into the future. Not by forcing stillness, but by releasing urgency. Not by suppressing desire, but by removing dependency. This is the moment when the field can respond without distortion. Not because you asked louder, but because you finally stopped pulling the signal out of tune. Excitement is often mistaken for readiness, but they are not the same frequency. Excitement is a spike. It rises quickly, peaks sharply, and collapses just as fast. It is reactive. It depends on anticipation, imagination, and projected outcomes. Signal readiness is different. It is not elevated. It is even. It does not surge forward. It settles inward. The field does not lock onto spikes. It responds to stability. Excitement carries volatility. Beneath it lives impatience. Beneath it lives expectation. Even when excitement feels positive, it is still leaning into the future, asking something to arrive to justify the feeling. This leaning creates oscillation. One moment you feel close, the next moment you feel delayed. That swing destabilizes the signal. The field cannot establish contact with a frequency that keeps changing its position. Readiness feels quieter than most people expect. It does not announce itself. It does not come with fireworks or urgency. It often arrives disguised as neutrality. Calm certainty. Emotional stillness. A sense that nothing needs to happen right now for things to be okay. This is not resignation. It is coherence. When the emotional baseline smooths out, the signal becomes readable. Neutrality does not mean you stop caring. It means your care is no longer tied to timing. Desire remains, but it is no longer charged with tension. The body is not bracing. The mind is not scanning. There is no internal countdown. This is the state the field recognizes as readiness because it can respond without destabilizing the system receiving the response. Stillness is one of the clearest indicators of stabilization. Not forced stillness. Not silence as discipline. Natural stillness. The kind that arrives when questions dissolve on their own. When the urge to figure everything out fades without being suppressed. This stillness signals that the identity has stopped interfering with the transmission. The field does not compete with noise. It waits for quiet. Calm certainty is another marker. Not confidence based on belief, but certainty without explanation. You do not know how you know. You simply do. There is no need to convince yourself or others. This certainty does not fluctuate with external feedback. It is not dependent on signs or progress. It is grounded in the present moment. This is why it holds. Excitement wants movement. Readiness allows response. Excitement says something is about to happen. Readiness says something is already aligned. One reaches forward. The other stands still. The field mirrors the latter. This is why contact phases rarely begin at emotional highs. They begin after the high fades and something steadier remains. If you have noticed less emotional charge around what you once wanted desperately, that is not loss. That is stabilization. The signal no longer needs amplification. The frequency underneath has settled into coherence. This is when responsiveness becomes possible. Not because you are more energized, but because you are no longer pulling yourself out of alignment with anticipation. Readiness is not loud. It does not rush. It does not demand confirmation. It is felt as grounded presence. And when that presence stabilizes, the field finally has something it can meet without distortion. What follows marks a shift in orientation. Until now, everything has been internal: stabilization, coherence, readiness. From here, the emphasis moves outward, not as pursuit, but as recognition. This phase is not about something entering your life. It is about noticing that a dialogue has already begun. The field has not been waiting to arrive. It has been waiting to reply. Arrival implies distance. Reply implies resonance. Once your signal stabilized, the field no longer needed to bridge a gap. It could respond immediately because coherence removed delay. This is why contact does not announce itself with spectacle. It shows up as feedback. As response. As subtle acknowledgement that your frequency is now readable. Response is rarely dramatic at first. It comes as microsynchronizations, slight shifts in timing, unexpected ease, or a quiet sense that something is aligning without your involvement. You may notice that things answer you before you finish asking. Or that situations resolve themselves without effort. These are not coincidences. They are replies calibrated to match your level of stability. The field mirrors without overwhelming. Contact framed as arrival keeps identity positioned as separate. Contact framed as response dissolves that separation. You are not waiting for something to cross space or time. You are participating in an exchange that activates once interference drops. The moment your emotional baseline stabilized, the field began answering in the only language it uses: alignment. These replies are subtle because subtlety preserves coherence. Loud responses would destabilize the signal that just stabilized. The field is intelligent. It does not flood a channel that is still adjusting to its own clarity. It offers small confirmations, gentle nudges, almost unnoticeable at first. The quieter you remain, the clearer they become. Dialogue does not require interpretation. In fact, interpretation interferes. When you try to analyze the response, you pull yourself out of resonance. The field is not sending puzzles to be solved. It is adjusting reality around you to reflect your stabilized frequency. This can appear as delays resolving, people responding differently, opportunities dissolving or emerging without effort. These are replies, not messages. Once you see the field as responsive rather than distant, urgency dissolves. There is nothing to wait for because waiting assumes silence. Silence is not absence. Silence is the space where response becomes perceptible. The more neutral your state, the easier it is to notice how often reality answers without being asked. This dialogue does not require belief. It requires allowance. You do not need to trust the field. You only need to stop interrupting it. When you are not reaching, not scanning, not checking, response becomes obvious. Not because it increases, but because your awareness sharpens. The field has already begun replying because your signal no longer collapses under contact. This is not a special event. It is a functional exchange that activates when coherence is present. Nothing has arrived. Nothing needs to. The conversation was always here. You can hear it now because you are finally still enough to listen. Nothing dramatic is allowed at first because drama destabilizes coherence. The signal that just stabilized is still calibrating to its own clarity. Sudden intensity would overload it. The field is not withholding. It is protecting the integrity of the channel. When coherence is new, subtlety is not a delay, it is intelligence. Dramatic shifts feel appealing to the mind because the mind associates change with proof. But proof-seeking is a remnant of instability. The field does not confirm alignment through spectacle. Spectacle excites the nervous system. Excitation introduces oscillation. Oscillation distorts the signal. This is why immediate, overwhelming experiences tend to collapse into confusion or obsession afterward. They arrive louder than the identity can hold. Subtle responses are precise. They integrate without shock. They allow the nervous system to remain regulated while alignment deepens. The field always prioritizes sustainability over intensity. It is not interested in impressing you. It is interested in maintaining coherence long enough for the exchange to stabilize. This is why the first replies are almost easy to miss. They are scaled to your current capacity. Identity takes time to reorganize around a stabilized signal. If reality shifted too fast, the old identity structures would try to interpret, control, or claim ownership of the experience. That interference would fracture the channel. Restraint prevents regression. It keeps the exchange clean while the identity adjusts quietly in the background. This is not a test of patience. It is not a lesson in waiting. Waiting implies anticipation, and anticipation leans forward. What is happening here is different. The field is pacing itself to match your neutrality. The more neutral you remain, the more responsive it becomes. Subtlety is not slowness. It is synchronization. When people expect drama, they often miss alignment. They overlook the way things are resolving without effort. They dismiss ease because it does not feel significant enough. But ease is the signal. Ease indicates minimal resistance. Minimal resistance allows contact to deepen without distortion. This is how intelligence moves. Quietly. Efficiently. Without announcing itself. Restraint is a sign of trust from the field. It signals that your system is being treated as stable, not as something that needs to be jolted awake. The absence of fireworks is not absence of progress. It is confirmation that progress is no longer fragile. Fragile systems require stimulation. Stable systems require space. If you feel a sense of calm mixed with curiosity rather than urgency, that is coherence holding. If you feel less need to explain what is happening to yourself or others, that is restraint doing its work. The field is not building suspense. It is building capacity. Like the video now as a confirmation that this recognition has landed. Nothing dramatic is allowed at first because nothing dramatic is needed. The exchange has already begun. It is unfolding at the speed that preserves clarity. This is not delay. This is precision. Learning to read the reply without interfering is the skill that preserves contact. The field responds continuously once coherence is present, but most interference happens after the response, not before it. The moment you label, interpret, or assign meaning, the identity steps back in and reshapes the signal. This is why perception must remain clean. Non-reactive perception is not passive. It is alert without agenda. It is awareness without commentary. When something shifts around you, the invitation is not to explain it, claim it, or predict where it leads. The invitation is to notice it fully and let it pass through without contraction. Reaction introduces tension. Tension distorts transmission. Labeling collapses the field into concepts. The moment you decide what something means, you narrow its bandwidth. Interpretation turns response into narrative, and narrative reactivates the identity that wants control. The field does not communicate in stories. It communicates through alignment. When you witness without labeling, the response remains intact and can continue unfolding. Witnessing is the act of staying present without reaching forward or pulling backward. You do not freeze the moment. You do not chase it. You allow it to complete its movement. This preserves signal integrity because it does not introduce emotional charge. The field reads emotional charge as instruction. When there is none, it remains free to respond accurately. Interference often comes from good intentions. Wanting to understand. Wanting to confirm. Wanting to make sense of what is happening. These impulses are remnants of seeking. They subtly lean forward. The field responds best when there is nothing being asked of it. Not because questions are wrong, but because silence leaves space for reply. When you notice a response, the most coherent action is no action. No internal commentary. No expectation of repetition. No attempt to recreate the experience. Recreation is interference. It assumes control. Each response is specific to the moment. Trying to repeat it pulls you out of presence and back into anticipation. The body often knows before the mind. You may feel a softening, a sense of ease, a quiet clarity without explanation. Let it be enough. The moment you demand more, the signal shifts. Witnessing means trusting the sufficiency of what is present. This trust is not belief. It is non-resistance. Comment with the words, "I am ready," to anchor this timeline. Preserving signal integrity requires restraint after contact, not before it. The field will continue replying as long as the channel remains undistorted. You do not maintain this by effort. You maintain it by absence of interference. By letting each response complete itself without being owned. This is how dialogue deepens. Not through analysis, but through clear witnessing. What unfolds next is not about perception or response, but about identity adjustment. Once the field begins replying, the system that receives those replies must be refined. This phase is not external. It happens internally, quietly, through friction that appears just precise enough to sharpen coherence without breaking it. You are not being tested. Testing implies judgment, evaluation, and pass or fail outcomes. None of that applies here. The field does not test worthiness. It calibrates coherence. Friction appears not to measure you, but to tune you. It reveals where the signal still wavers so it can stabilize further. This is not punishment. It is alignment refining itself. Calibration feels uncomfortable only when it is misunderstood. When identity believes friction means something is wrong, resistance forms. Resistance amplifies the discomfort. But when friction is recognized as adjustment, the body relaxes. The signal stays clean. Calibration then completes more efficiently. The field always applies the minimum pressure required to refine bandwidth. Worthiness is irrelevant in this process. The field does not respond to moral value, effort, or intention. It responds to clarity. A stable signal does not need to prove itself. It only needs to remain coherent under changing conditions. This is why challenges appear after stabilization, not before. They are not obstacles to contact. They are refinements of it. Each challenge highlights a remaining distortion. Not to shame it, but to expose it. Exposure allows release. When an old emotional pattern surfaces, it is because it is losing relevance. It must pass through awareness one final time before dissolving. Calibration brings these patterns up briefly, then lets them go. The mistake is believing they mean regression. Bandwidth expands through precision, not intensity. The more coherent the signal becomes, the more subtle the calibration. Early friction may feel obvious. Later friction is nearly invisible. It shows up as slight discomfort, a gentle redirection, a moment of pause. These are signs of refinement, not resistance. The system is learning to hold more signal with less noise. Calibration also strips excess identity. Roles, narratives, and self-images that once felt important may lose charge. This can feel like loss, but it is actually efficiency. The signal carries less distortion when identity simplifies. What remains is functional. What falls away was interference. The field does not remove anything essential. When you stop interpreting friction as a test, it stops escalating. There is nothing to pass. Nothing to prove. Nothing to overcome. Calibration completes when the identity stops pushing against it. The moment resistance drops, refinement accelerates. This is why calm presence shortens adjustment phases dramatically. You are not being evaluated. You are being tuned. Each challenge is a micro-adjustment aligning you more precisely with the frequency you already stabilized into. When this is recognized, friction loses its emotional weight. It becomes informational, neutral, temporary. And the signal continues to clarify, not because you earned it, but because coherence always refines itself once it is established. The one who needed proof cannot come with you into this phase. Proof-seeking is not curiosity. It is instability looking for reassurance. It is the identity asking reality to confirm its position before it will relax. That request itself is distortion. The field does not respond to identities that need validation to remain coherent. It waits until coherence no longer depends on being convinced. The need for proof is rooted in fluctuation. When the signal is unstable, it looks outward for confirmation. Signs, synchronicities, results, or explanations are used to regulate emotion. This creates a feedback loop where the identity cannot settle unless something external responds. That loop fractures the signal. It teaches the field that coherence is conditional. Conditional coherence cannot sustain contact. As calibration continues, the identity that required reassurance begins to dissolve. This is not dramatic. It often feels like disinterest. A quiet detachment from checking, measuring, or explaining what is happening. You may notice that you stop looking for signs without consciously deciding to. The urge simply loses relevance. This is not apathy. It is certainty becoming internal. Validation is instability because it places coherence outside of you. It makes alignment dependent on feedback. The field mirrors this dependency by withholding confirmation. Not as punishment, but as accuracy. Once validation is no longer required, confirmation becomes unnecessary. Certainty does not demand to be proven. It exists without witnesses. The death of the proof seeker is the moment certainty stops fluctuating. You no longer feel better when something aligns or worse when it does not. Emotional neutrality deepens. This neutrality is not emptiness. It is steadiness. It allows the signal to hold without reinforcement. This is why contact stabilizes only after the need for reassurance collapses. Certainty that emerges without proof feels different than belief. Belief needs maintenance. Certainty does not. It is not loud. It does not argue. It does not convince. It simply remains. You may find that you cannot explain why you know what you know. Explanation is no longer required. The knowing holds itself. This shift often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. The mind may search for the familiar feedback loops and find them gone. This can create a brief sense of emptiness. That emptiness is space. It is where coherence expands. The field responds cleanly to this space because nothing in it is asking to be filled. When proof is no longer needed, the signal becomes self-sustaining. It does not rise or fall based on outcomes. It does not react to timing. It does not seek reinforcement. This is the identity that can hold contact without distortion. Not because it has answers, but because it no longer needs them. What dies here is not awareness. It is dependency. And in its absence, certainty emerges naturally. Quietly. Permanently. Silence is the strongest signal you can hold because it carries no demand. Demand bends the field. Silence leaves it undisturbed. When the signal reaches this stage, transmission no longer depends on output. It depends on absence. The absence of reaching. The absence of explanation. The absence of internal noise that tries to steer the response. Silence is not the absence of awareness. It is awareness without commentary. When you stop narrating your experience, the signal sharpens. Words, even internal ones, compress frequency into form. Silence keeps it expansive. This is why the most coherent states feel spacious rather than focused. The field responds more cleanly to space than to instruction. Demand is the primary source of distortion. Even subtle expectation carries weight. It asks reality to adjust before it has fully responded. Silence removes the request. When there is no demand, the field is free to answer without resistance. This freedom is what allows coherence to maintain itself. Silence does not pull. It does not push. It allows. Many mistake silence for inaction or disengagement. In truth, silence is active alignment. It is the state where nothing is being added to the signal that does not belong there. When you are silent internally, you are no longer shaping the response. You are letting it complete its movement. Completion is what stabilizes contact. Silence also prevents identity from reasserting control. Identity speaks in preferences, fears, interpretations, and timelines. Silence dissolves these layers temporarily, creating a clean channel. The field recognizes this immediately. Not because silence sends a message, but because it removes interference. What remains is coherence. This is why silence often feels powerful and uncomfortable at the same time. The mind wants to fill space. It wants to do something with the stillness. But filling it reintroduces noise. Holding silence requires trust. Not trust in an outcome, but trust in coherence itself. The moment you trust the signal to hold without commentary, it does. Silence maintains coherence because it does not fluctuate. Words fluctuate. Emotions fluctuate when they are charged. Silence is stable. It does not spike. It does not collapse. It remains. This consistency is what allows the field to remain engaged without recalibrating constantly. Stability invites response. In silence, there is no asking and no resisting. There is only presence. Presence is the highest fidelity transmission. It requires no effort and no reinforcement. It does not need to be protected. It protects itself by not moving. When silence becomes natural rather than forced, the signal reaches peak clarity. Not because it is louder, but because nothing is obscuring it. This is the state where contact no longer feels like an event. It feels like continuity. The exchange sustains itself without attention. Silence is not something you practice. It is something that remains once interference falls away. And once it remains, coherence holds effortlessly. This is why silence is not the absence of signal. It is the signal in its most undistorted form. What opens now is not movement forward, but selection completing itself. Until this point, alignment has been about internal stabilization, perception, and coherence. From here, the relationship reverses. You are no longer choosing a timeline through effort or preference. The aligned timeline has begun selecting you back. Timeline selection has always been reciprocal. You were never pulling yourself into a future. You were tuning yourself into resonance. Once coherence stabilized, the field no longer waited for direction. It responded by locking onto the frequency you now hold consistently. This is why the sense of choice begins to soften. What remains feels inevitable, not because options disappeared, but because only one path continues to resonate. Inevitability is not force. It is gravity. It is the sensation that certain outcomes feel closer without being pursued. You may notice that alternatives lose emotional charge. They do not tempt you. They do not excite or frighten you. They simply feel irrelevant. This is timeline selection in motion. Not through decision, but through resonance withdrawing support from what no longer matches. Identity-based resonance is the mechanism. Timelines do not respond to desire. They respond to who you are being consistently. When identity stabilizes, it emits a clear signature. The field mirrors that signature by arranging circumstances that match it. This is not reward. It is alignment expressing itself spatially and temporally. At this stage, effort feels unnecessary because selection is no longer manual. You may feel guided without instructions. Pulled without pressure. Certain actions feel obvious without needing justification. This is not intuition becoming louder. It is noise falling away. When only one frequency remains active, direction feels simple. The sense of inevitability can be unsettling at first. The mind is accustomed to managing options. When options fade, it may interpret that as loss of control. In truth, it is loss of interference. Control was never selecting timelines accurately. Resonance was. Now that resonance is stable, selection completes itself without negotiation. This does not mean events rush forward. It means resistance falls away. Movement may still be subtle. But it carries weight. It feels anchored. When something aligns now, it stays aligned. When something dissolves, it does not return. This permanence is not rigidity. It is coherence holding its shape. You are not being carried somewhere unfamiliar. You are being met by what already matches you. The timeline responding now is not new. It is the one that has always been in range but could not lock until the signal stabilized. Now it can. And because it can, it does. Selection feels quieter than expectation. There is no announcement. No dramatic crossing point. Just a growing sense that things are arranging themselves without being managed. This is the signature of reciprocal alignment. You are not choosing the timeline anymore. The timeline is recognizing you as compatible and holding you in place. This is not destiny imposed from outside. It is inevitability emerging from coherence. When identity and frequency match, selection completes itself. And from here forward, movement is no longer about deciding where to go, but allowing what already resonates to continue unfolding. Going back is no longer comfortable because your signal no longer matches what you are trying to return to. Discomfort is not resistance from the world. It is guidance from coherence. When a timeline loses resonance, the body registers it immediately. Not as danger, but as misalignment. The field does not punish divergence. It simply withdraws support from what no longer fits. Emotional discomfort is the first indicator. Situations that once felt familiar now feel heavy, draining, or strangely hollow. Conversations require effort. Environments feel loud even when they are quiet. This is not because something has gone wrong. It is because your baseline frequency has shifted. What used to feel neutral now feels off because neutrality has moved. Environmental discomfort follows emotional misalignment. Physical spaces, routines, or relationships may begin to feel constrictive. Not hostile. Just incompatible. This incompatibility is not a judgment. It is a measurement. The field is showing you where coherence can no longer be maintained without distortion. Staying would require shrinking the signal. The body resists that automatically. This discomfort is often misunderstood as regression or fear. In reality, it is precision. When alignment deepens, tolerance for distortion decreases. You are no longer able to override misalignment with effort. This is not weakness. It is efficiency. The system no longer wastes energy sustaining timelines that cannot support the signal you now hold. There is no punishment embedded in this process. Nothing is being taken away to teach you a lesson. What dissolves was never stable at your current frequency. The field does not remove what matches. It only releases what requires compromise. Discomfort is simply the sensation of compromise becoming unsustainable. Attempting to go back often intensifies the discomfort. Not because you are being blocked, but because the signal must distort itself to fit. That distortion is felt immediately. The body tightens. The mind becomes restless. Emotional charge increases. These are not warnings. They are feedback. The system is telling you that coherence cannot be maintained here. This is why returning to old habits, roles, or environments feels more exhausting than before. You are not failing to readjust. You are succeeding at alignment. The ease you once felt in those spaces depended on a frequency you no longer emit consistently. The field reflects that shift without commentary. Discomfort is directional. It does not tell you where to go. It tells you where not to stay. This is an important distinction. Expecting comfort to guide you forward creates confusion. Comfort at this stage is not found by moving ahead. It is found by not resisting what is already releasing. When you stop framing discomfort as punishment, it loses its emotional charge. It becomes information. Neutral. Temporary. You do not need to analyze it or fix it. You only need to stop forcing compatibility where it no longer exists. Going back feels uncomfortable because you have already moved. Not physically. Coherently. The timeline you stabilized into cannot be undone without effort, and effort is now the clearest signal of misalignment. This discomfort is not an obstacle. It is confirmation that the field has already adjusted to who you are now. There is a movement happening now that does not feel like effort. It does not announce itself as progress. It feels more like being leaned into by reality itself. This is the subtle gravity that appears once resistance dissolves. You are no longer pushing forward. You are being pulled by coherence. Push dynamics require force. They depend on motivation, discipline, and constant correction. Pull dynamics require none of that. They emerge when alignment becomes stable enough that movement happens naturally. You may notice that decisions feel simpler. Actions require less justification. What once felt difficult now feels obvious. This is not because circumstances change dramatically, but because resistance is no longer generating drag. The pull is subtle because it does not activate urgency. It does not create pressure. It does not demand speed. It feels calm. Almost quiet. And because it lacks intensity, it is easy to overlook. Many mistake this ease for stagnation. In reality, ease is the signature of coherence in motion. When friction disappears, movement feels slower even as it becomes more effective. Push always carries tension. Even when successful, it leaves residue in the nervous system. Pull leaves none. You move because it feels natural to move, not because you are trying to get somewhere. This is why forward motion now feels self-guiding. You are not steering. You are responding to resonance. When something aligns, it draws you in. When it does not, it loses gravitational pull. As resistance dissolves, effort feels increasingly unnecessary. This can be disorienting at first. The mind expects struggle to accompany change. When struggle is absent, it questions legitimacy. But alignment does not require effort to prove itself. It requires consistency. The pull you feel is consistency expressing itself through motion. This gravity is not emotional excitement. It does not spike. It does not promise outcomes. It simply persists. Day after day, certain directions feel lighter. Certain actions feel cleaner. Certain connections feel easier to maintain. This is not preference. It is resonance. The field is arranging momentum around what no longer needs to be forced. Ease increases not because everything becomes perfect, but because fewer things require resistance. You stop arguing with what is leaving. You stop dragging what does not want to move. Energy returns because it is no longer being spent on friction. This reclaimed energy becomes motion. Quiet, continuous, reliable. The pull forward does not ask you to hurry. In fact, rushing disrupts it. When you try to accelerate, you reintroduce push. The gravity works best when you allow its pace. That pace is always precise. It moves as fast as coherence can be maintained. Faster would destabilize. Slower would be unnecessary. You may find that you cannot fully explain why you are moving in certain directions now. Explanation belongs to push logic. Pull does not justify itself. It simply feels right without urgency. This feeling is not emotional. It is structural. It is alignment making movement inevitable. As resistance continues to dissolve, motion becomes less noticeable but more consistent. You are not being propelled. You are being held and drawn forward at the same time. This is the gravity of coherence. It does not rush. It does not stop. It simply continues, carrying you without strain into what already matches the signal you now hold. What completes here is not a process of reaching outward, but a realization turning inward. Up to this point, contact may have been framed as something that happens between you and something else. From here, that framing dissolves. What is revealed now is simpler and more destabilizing to the old model. Contact is not communication. It is recognition. Communication assumes separation. A sender. A receiver. A distance bridged by signals. That model collapses the moment coherence stabilizes. There is no exchange happening across space. There is no message traveling toward you. What you are experiencing as contact is the moment the signal recognizes itself without distortion. Nothing new is added. Nothing is transmitted. Something familiar becomes obvious. Recognition does not arrive as information. It arrives as resonance. It feels like remembering something you never learned. This is why contact often lacks novelty. The mind expects revelation. What appears instead is familiarity without source. This familiarity is not comforting or dramatic. It is grounding. It settles rather than excites. That is how you know it is real. Exchange models fail here because they keep identity positioned as small. As a receiver. As something waiting to be addressed. That identity cannot sustain contact without turning it into dependency. Recognition removes the hierarchy. There is nothing above you reaching down. There is nothing outside you sending signals inward. The signal and the awareness of it are the same thing. You are not tuned into something else. You are tuned into yourself without interference. The field responds because it always has. What changed was not the field. It was the clarity of the signal perceiving itself. When distortion dropped away, recognition became possible. This is why contact feels internal even when it appears to affect the external world. The viewer is not a person having an experience. The viewer is the consciousness registering coherence. This distinction matters. As long as identity remains central, contact feels fragile. Once identity relaxes, contact feels continuous. Not because it is maintained, but because it no longer depends on effort or interpretation. Recognition does not ask questions. It does not analyze itself. It does not seek validation. It simply knows. This knowing is quiet. It does not require explanation. Attempts to explain it pull you back into communication models. Explanation reintroduces distance. Recognition collapses it. This is why contact cannot be forced or summoned. You cannot communicate your way into recognition. You can only remove what prevents it. Once interference drops, recognition happens on its own. Effort delays it. Silence reveals it. Stillness allows it to stabilize. When you understand that you are the signal, the search ends naturally. There is nothing left to receive. There is only coherence becoming aware of itself. This is not an ending. It is not a climax. It is a return to baseline at a higher clarity. Contact is not something you have. It is something you are aware of being. And once that awareness stabilizes, it does not turn off. It does not need reinforcement. Recognition holds itself, because it was never separate to begin with. Nothing new is coming to you because nothing new is required. Novelty belongs to the seeking phase. It belongs to the identity that believes something external must arrive to complete it. Once recognition stabilizes, that belief collapses. What remains is remembrance, not acquisition. Contact does not deliver information. It restores familiarity. Novelty seeking is movement away from coherence. It reaches for stimulation to maintain interest. It confuses excitement with truth. The field does not operate through surprise. Surprise destabilizes. Authentic contact feels the opposite of surprising. It feels known. When something truly aligns, there is no rush of discovery. There is a quiet settling, as if something long understood has returned to the surface. Learning implies accumulation. It suggests that you are incomplete and must be filled. Remembrance implies removal. It suggests that what you are realizing was always present, obscured only by interference. This is why contact does not expand the mind. It clears it. The less there is to process, the clearer recognition becomes. When people expect new revelations, they often overlook what is actually happening. They dismiss familiarity as imagination. But imagination excites. Familiarity grounds. Authentic contact carries weight because it does not fluctuate. It does not need to convince. It simply is. The absence of novelty is the confirmation. This phase dismantles the habit of searching for the next insight. The next message. The next sign. Searching assumes lack. Lack reintroduces separation. Once recognition occurs, searching feels unnecessary, even exhausting. Not because curiosity died, but because coherence no longer depends on stimulation. Familiarity does not mean repetition. It means resonance. You may encounter the same themes, the same understandings, but they land deeper each time. Not as new information, but as clearer alignment. The signal sharpens not by adding layers, but by removing noise. Each return feels simpler, quieter, more obvious. This is why contact feels subtle and ordinary. It integrates seamlessly into awareness. It does not demand attention. It does not interrupt life. It becomes part of the background coherence. The mind may struggle with this because it equates significance with intensity. But intensity is not truth. Stability is. When nothing new arrives, the system relaxes. There is no pressure to keep up. No fear of missing something. No urgency to decode experiences. This relaxation allows coherence to deepen naturally. The field responds to this depth by maintaining alignment, not by escalating content. Remembrance does not entertain the mind. It satisfies the signal. And once the signal is satisfied, the cycle of seeking completes itself. You stop asking what comes next because nothing is missing now. What remains is presence without anticipation. Authentic contact always feels like this. Quiet. Familiar. Unremarkable to the mind. Profound to the system. Not because it brings something new, but because it restores what was always already there. The signal holds itself now. This is not a state you need to maintain, protect, or return to. It has stabilized beyond dependence on attention. What once required awareness now sustains itself without monitoring. This is how you know the phase has completed. Effort is no longer relevant. Irreversible stabilization does not feel dramatic. It feels ordinary. Quiet. Almost unnoticed by the mind. But the system knows. The nervous system no longer scans for alignment. The emotional baseline no longer fluctuates with outcomes. There is a settled quality that does not rise or fall. This is not confidence. It is structural coherence. Autonomy is the defining feature of this stage. The signal no longer depends on practices, reminders, or correction. You do not need to stay present to keep it active. Presence is now the default. Even distraction does not collapse it. Even emotion does not distort it. The frequency holds through movement, through rest, through change. Monitoring ends naturally. You stop checking whether you are aligned. You stop asking if something is working. These questions lose relevance because coherence no longer feels fragile. The identity that needed reassurance dissolved earlier. What remains does not require confirmation. It simply continues. This does not mean challenges disappear. It means they no longer destabilize the signal. Events move through without pulling you off center. Emotional waves pass without reprogramming your frequency. You remain intact without effort. This is the difference between control and stability. Control is active. Stability is self-sustaining. Calm finality does not mean stagnation. Movement continues. Timelines unfold. But nothing feels urgent. Nothing feels precarious. There is no sense of missing something essential. The system rests in adequacy. Not because everything is perfect, but because nothing is threatening coherence anymore. You may notice that you no longer feel the need to talk about what happened. Language feels insufficient. Explanation feels unnecessary. This is not secrecy. It is completion. When something integrates fully, it stops asking to be processed. It simply becomes part of the background structure. The signal holding itself does not mean you have arrived somewhere. It means you stopped leaving. There is no maintenance routine. No vigilance required. Awareness can move freely without destabilizing the field. This is what autonomy looks like at the level of frequency. Nothing needs to be protected because nothing is being generated anymore. The signal is not in motion. It is in balance. Balance does not need to be defended. It persists by nature. This is not an ending you announce. It is one you live without noticing. The field does not escalate after this. It stabilizes into continuity. And continuity does not demand attention. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it before their timeline closes.